Welcome to Educational Alpha. I'm Bill Kelly, CEO of Kaya and your host, bringing you on-the-ground conversations with business leaders, educators, and industry colleagues from around the globe.
In this episode, Tracy Vegro, a prominent figure in the financial services sector, joins Bill to discuss the significance of relevance, inclusion, and certainty in an uncertain world. The conversation covers integrity, ethics, culture, collaboration, and global economic development. Tracy shares insights on careers, digitization, AI, legal and regulatory fields, diversity, and the role of professional bodies. Listen in.
Tracy Vegro, welcome to Educational Alpha.
Thank you, Bill. It's a great pleasure to join you.
Pleasure's all mine. It's been a while. I think we met what might have been day one on the job. And I do like the fact that it's the CC, not CC. And I may turn our brand into the Kaya. We can work on that with our branding people. But what first impressions matter. And you came into the room and joined a large table talking about ESG, but more specifically climate, with George Littlejohn, who I've known a while. But you must have had a very hectic day. And I think you said, hey, I'm just going to come in and say hello. But you did that, but then you sat down and you participated. And I never got the sense that you were drumming your fingers on the table saying, I got somebody else to see. And I think it speaks to you as a person and your brand as well. So congratulations on that. But I do want to maybe just first turn it over to you and introduce Tracy and some of your backgrounds. And maybe you can culminate with what the CC is up to as it enters what seems to be its fourth decade. It seems like you just celebrated your 30th anniversary. So congrats on that as well.
Oh, thank you so much, Bill. I mean, you've got a brilliant memory. It was indeed my first day in the job. I think it was kind of mid-morning. I couldn't not come and see you because it was such a good opportunity to visit colleagues visiting from the States. But it was such a genius conversation that you'd got going. And given my background and just coming from regulation and the FRC, where we're doing so much here in the UK around the corporate governance of ESG and trying to develop frameworks and so on. It was kind of one of those conversations that I couldn't miss. And then, of course, there was you and your colleagues, and it was just like, it just flowed. And in a way, that's kind of how I feel about my time at the CISI. It's gone really, really, really fast. I think about 7 months in now, and I just can't believe I've managed to get to see colleagues in Colombo. I've visited colleagues in our Dubai office in the Middle East. You're quite right. We're a body that's all about education and qualifications, continuing professional development. But we've also got a thought leadership role, if you like, across on some of the issues around, financial literacy, people accessing help and advice from the sector when they need it. What kind of careers are people going to have in financial services going forward? What does digitization really mean? In the UK this week, we've had a big summit all about AI. Who's going to be the global regulator of the ethics of AI then? I mean, that's a massive question. So yeah, it was fabulous that I'm now talking to you in a little bit more detail, but it was a great first day and I'll never, ever forget that you were there to help me enjoy it.
Well, the pleasure is mine. And maybe drilling a little bit down more on the CC. So coming from the U.S., I know you have somewhat of a presence here, but it more seems to be the UK, the Eurozone, and then the world beyond. And I just got back from Mumbai. I met some of your colleagues there, and to see the influence, the impact, and the penetration you have in so many markets is really quite impressive. So as you think about the gamut of investment education, it's a hard thing to do because we're trying to retroactively bring order to an industry that's highly regulated. But if we've got 190 some odd different countries, we probably have 190 some odd different capital markets and regulatory regimes and mid and back office functions. And I know Kaya's role is narrow but deep. We're trying to bring greater transparency into diversification by bringing all alternatives, not just alternatives, but how do alternatives fit into an asset allocation mix? How do you define the CC's fit into that ecosystem? What is your your hack, so to speak, in terms of what you're trying to solve for?
Well, I think it depends. Going first principles, I'd say it's good for us because we are a charity. And that gives us the opportunity to do work in some of the developing countries you touched on. So, we're very proud of the work we do in Africa and India. I signed only a few weeks ago a new memorandum of understanding with colleagues at the Moroccan Stock Exchange. We have standards and values at the heart of what we do. And I think that means the traditions that the Institute stands for have resonance and reach and value well beyond the shores of the UK. And in a way, it's a bit of a cliche, but the UK may be a small island, but we actually do some big thinking. And I think that's one of the things that we can do through the Institute. The other thing I'd say is that youngsters going into financial services, no matter where they start, what country, they're probably going to move around a lot more than perhaps I've done in my career. And so actually understanding that certain principles, and again, I think it's where we've got common cause with you, Bill, certain things are givens. Acting with integrity, espousing strong ethics and values are really important. They're important not just for the people working in the sector, but they're really, really important in terms of building trust. And for more and more people to take the advice they need. All of us, fortunately, are generally living longer, having a longer retirement to plan for. Not all investment advice is about wealth management in the classic sense or corporate investment, as most people kind of would understand it. A lot more people have assets well beyond what our forefathers would have ever imagined, particularly in the UK, where the housing market has been so strong for such a long time. So the idea of inheritance and planning for maybe the next generation of your family's future means that there are so many more roles that our members and those who qualify with us initially go on to do in a range of roles that require that continued development. So for us, it's about what we do domestically, resonating internationally, but equally it's about us doing that thought leadership. It's engaging and listening to people, understanding what things like climate change, ESG mean, ethical AI, absolute accessibility in a way that customers probably never imagined a few years ago through online services and so on. What's that doing to this? How do we stay at the forefront of that development without kind of frightening people that everything is going to change so much, so dramatically and so quickly? So they're some of the things we do. But as I say, it's a privilege to do it in a charitable organization because that gives you the opportunity to do things and share knowledge, share understanding, research in a way that in a classically commercial environment you perhaps wouldn't do.
So, just one follow up on the background, then we can look forward. Some of these concepts you mentioned about generative AI, which has really just been in the conversation just a handful of months. And while ESG and climate go back many, many decades, back when CC was founded in 1992, that was not on the tips of people's tongues, certainly not in the US, maybe in the UK and the Eurozone. But when the London Stock Exchange decided they needed to found an organization like the CC, what was the motivation? What were they trying to solve for when they first formed it?
Well, I guess, it was going back to that whole concept now that no one really remembers, the Big Bang and opening up trading in the market. So I guess it was about transparency, making sure people understood that there was some oversight of some of these important aspects of how investments and securities and so on are traded. Many, many people, even very sort of city-focused economists and so on, don't necessarily understand some of the practicalities of what the jobs cover. And I think that was an important reason. I also think that the ability of people to be part of a membership body that strives for something, that really stands for something decade after decade, as you say, we're just entered our fourth decade. That's a long time. Many companies change enormously through a period of that time. They might be subject to all sorts of different changes. We have that consistency at our heart. And I think the chartered bodies generally, the fact that you've got a royal charter, that really means something in terms of longevity and the place you play alongside other big city institutions. And I think no matter what country you're in, that importance, that chartered status really does allow us to get a seat at many more tables than we would otherwise. And you get to really influence the debate. And for me, that's so important. I'm a former government policymaker and a regulator in financial services. I wish I'd known more about the role that professional bodies play and how much talking sooner rather than later to some of the people who are going to be at the sharp end of how the policies actually play out can actually make for better policy making. And recently here in London, we were very, very pleased that the new Department for Business and Trade reached out to us about a digital register for professional awarding bodies, which we are. And we're included in that. And I think that's a massively important calling card when we're going in with the different networks we have in all the different countries to say, this is all very, very high quality that you will be joining. Our qualifications are second to none. You will be joining a community of practice that is outstanding and will stay with you for your whole career. It really matters. And there's very few things in life, I think, that matter to people over such a long career path. And that's the aspiration we have, for the next 30 years. We are going to be absolutely working with young professional networks, students who are still in college. Our network of student ambassadors is really important to us, really making a difference in sort of diversity terms. Everyone talks about diversity now, but how do you really make it happen? How do you get more women on boards? How do you get more people from different backgrounds contributing their ideas in a sort of corporate context? There's the things that, again, we hope we will be shaping the future that's good for our members and good for society more generally, because that's what you have to reflect. The needs of customers, clients, members of the public, they're changing very quickly.
They certainly are. And a couple of things. One, as a former policymaker and a regulator, if you can help bring that message back, including to the U.S. about the work that not only you're doing, but Kaya's doing. The lobbyist bodies, and certainly in the U.S., are so extraordinarily powerful. In order to get your nose into that room is very, very difficult to do. And I'm just saying, hey, we're trying to put the interest of the investor first. I am the lobbyist for the client. And if I'm coming in with open hands like that, we should be welcomed in and figure out how to make a difference. It's not that we're not welcomed in. We're in a blind spot. And when you think about democratization of alts, and we now have the SEC and FINRA thinking about a third pathway to accredited investor designation, and it's going to be around an exam. And Kai is very, very well positioned there, not to be the only participant, but to have a seat at the table and make a difference. But I think sometimes these policymakers can't look beyond the tip of their nose. And I think given the evolution of your career, you're a rare breed. So if it can keep carrying that flag, it's going to be good for all of us.
I'm going to definitely take on that mantle for you, Bill, because I really think it's important. The other thing that I think is important that I've only latterly realized is how what people say and what they do absolutely have to marry up. And when you're a member of a professional body, that behavior is so, so important, because time and time again, we see lots of regulation that's supposedly really clear, but the people who are being regulated don't understand the behaviors that are associated with some of those standards, and it falls down. I don't know where you are coming from in terms of some of the cultural shifts in the US, but here in London, faith in politicians is not as good as it could be. There's so much political turmoil. We have very high inflation. All of these things puts a real premium on advice being high quality and timely. And that's something that, again, anybody working in financial services sector, they do understand their customer base. And in a way, I think that's very powerful. I think we're a source of advice well beyond what people might imagine, and higher levels of trust and so on than people would expect.
Well, I think inflation, you folks are sustaining north of 9, we're at 5, so I'll cede that to you. But in terms of craziness of politics, I think we have you beat in the U.S., but we'll make political statements there. But we'll leave that for the audience to debate. So I want to move to some of the innovations, and you mentioned both ESG and climate, but then I want to start with AI and generative AI and Chat GPT. This is, as I mentioned a moment ago, has been in the common vernacular just for a handful of months. And I was at a conference yesterday, and I asked a very well-known U.S. investor who's in this thematic disruption space about the concept of AI. And it was a two-part question, which I'm not sure if I was crazy about the answer, but the killer app is trust. And if we don't have trust in the room, it's not going to work. And maybe a first derivative of trust is regulation. And you can't be crazy with regulation and rinse out the value proposition, but there have to be some rules of the road so we don't kill somebody or get killed ourselves. And I think that in the US, maybe we're going a bit too far with regulation at times and we push it offshore as opposed to embracing it and bringing it back. But to think about some of these technologies, we should figure out how to use them. But if we overregulate them, we're going to rinse out the value proposition in the first place. If we don't, we're going to have just an anarchy in our hands, and we're going to end up with a lot of these Sam Bankman-Fried FTX outcomes, which is just bad for the investors. So your views on both trust and the importance of regulation.
Well, it's interesting. I'll declare a bit of an interest here because prior to joining the Institute, I was at the Solicitors Regulation Authority. And you probably hear a lot about so-called law tech and actually whether some of the AI-enabled tools are better at predicting court outcomes or case predictions and so on. So it was a very difficult subject. But what we did through the Ministry of Justice here in the UK was have something called the Sandbox. We've set up this organisation that's a sort of private sector collaboration called Law Tech UK. And I chair what's called the Regulatory Response Unit. I still do that now because the board here at the Institute allow me to do it on a non-executive capacity. And I think it's fascinating how much some of the issues that are going to play out in fintech are slightly bedding in now in law tech. So I would suggest that things like sandboxes, where the regulator has a much more proactive approach and people who are at the really high end, innovative end of things can go to the regulator and say, hey, I've got this idea, this is a project, and that they go through a process of collaboration with the regulator as to how it might or might not have positive or negative outcomes, how it does or doesn't fit within the existing regulatory oversight, whether or not there are any particular jeopardies or legislative shortcuts that might be a detriment to customers. So that approach is one that many people were quite frightened of. It seemed quite scary, to put your trust into somebody who's developing something that, we've seen casualties of elsewhere in the world. But I think it's working well. It's a great privilege to chair it because what you do is an appreciation of how the commercial world comes in where they see a need for something. And the regulator can often be a bit slow. It's just to do with the pace of how public policymaking and regulation operate. So I think if you can get those sort of sandboxes, the kind of free space, where as a regulator, you cannot give people a formal approval, but you can give them your time and insights and share some of that knowledge and those findings really openly in a completely open source way. So there's no competitive advantage to anybody. I think that can get everybody embracing innovation in a much, much better way. And for me, that is how you'll see some of the steps along the way of making sure that technology benefits everybody and actually grows our economy and the global economy more generally and sees things even more secure. Trading, digitization of the some of the platforms has already happened. Compliance, a lot of compliance and risk is managed through monitoring trends and so on, which is done through digital means. So it's kind of knitting together the different strands in a way that avoids any kind of negative consequences, but doesn't preclude everybody understanding and boosting people's understanding in a good way in real time, to me, is the key. It's the key for regulators or politicians, civil servants. All of that has got to be not to hold back the tide of change, but to facilitate it happening in a way that doesn't have, as I said before, unintended consequences.
And when I think about reg tech, ed tech, and the list goes on and on.
Maintain another big
Yeah, it's to support the word that comes before it. And I think there's two missing parts of this conversation globally. Client tech, and if I take GPT, client GPT, not index GPT, Bloomberg GPT. They're important, but what it means for the client. And that's what I think is perhaps missing, that they're the runt of the litter, last one at the bowl, but it's their assets that is driving this industry. And I think oftentimes we forget that.
Do you know, that's really well put, Bill? Really well put. Because I think people do understand this kind of, it's follow the money is a classic phrase, but follow whose money and for what benefit. And people forget how much financial services contributes just generally to everybody's economy. There are a lot of jobs in the UK. There are a lot of jobs that we still can't necessarily attract the young talent into. We've got this huge issue at the moment, not just around people staying in the sector, but getting them to join in the first place. Young people's aspirations now for quite different kind of jobs, and some of the people are much more motivated by going into jobs in relation to climate change related activities, and certain areas of investment just don't appeal to them anymore. And that's going to be a bit of a worry, isn't it? Because that will cause gaps that then potentially there will be some detriment. So I think you're a very apt point to make, and probably not one that we debate enough actually in terms of the policy and where it's leading.
And as we maybe think about moving toward a conclusion here, Tracy, one of the things, if somebody says to me, well, what keeps you up at night? I think I would describe it in one word, which is relevancy. That my mission has to be relevant. And it's not just by voice, it's got to be by action. And in the good old days, it was easier both to say and to do because the pace of change was somewhat glacial. But I look at the last, say, 5+ years and the 5 years looking out, and the pace of change is going to be extraordinarily rapid. And we just mentioned generative AI is just one example, but the introduction of blockchain, what that means about trade settlement, and not an elimination, but a reset of all the intermediaries that help settle and process trading. So how does relevancy ring your bell inside of the CISI? And how do you stay in front of that? It's not an easy job that both you and I have, but I think it's a very important one. It really describes how successful we're going to be, not for ourselves, but for the end investor.
Well, apart from saying here, I agree with all you just said. I would say, yeah, relevance. For me, also inclusion is a very important word that I apply to what motivates me. I think as a body that is here to voice the importance of integrity, ethics, long-termism, it's sometimes hard to articulate that as what does it mean then? What 2 or 3 things does it mean? But for me, it is absolutely about trying to give certainty to our members in a very uncertain world. And that will embrace training, standards, behaviors. Culture is a much used word, but massively not very well defined in any organization. Then if I had to alight on one thing to add to yours, it would be culture, and understanding that financial services as a sector is a very broad church, and one that we have to really understand what we intend and what is perceived by people who are customers or clients can be quite different. And we must be mindful of that. And then the other thing is we've got to showcase what we do. I'm always really pleased when I see posts from you on LinkedIn and so on. But as professional networks, I do think we have to be a bit bolder about shouting about some of the good things we do, because otherwise it just gets crowded out. So the idea that we're collaborating today on this podcast is fantastic. But I'd love to see us collaborate across the Atlantic in all sorts of different ways. And the beauty of virtual communication is you really can do that. So, whatever happens next, as long as the commitment continues to collaboration, I think we really will develop a really good global economy that starts to benefit more and more people. And for me, that would be the aspiration for our institute, yours, and many others around the world.
Well, I could bring this to a very quick close, which you have opened up, but I want to slightly go into overtime because you mentioned diversity a couple of times. And I think this is an important point to end on because you are a very successful professional, full stop, but you happen to be a woman. And I have had my own success and I happen to be a white man. And I'm sure the pathway for me was easier for you. But what are some of your observations about doing over saying? And the slogan is around ESG and DE&I is very easy to get on the bandwagon. But and I think maybe it gets back to culture. What are we doing to make this better? So maybe I think this is an even better way to close. Some of your observations about where we are and how we as professionals can do a better job to put the concept of DE&I out of business. Because if we put it out of business, it means we've succeeded and we don't need to talk about it anymore.
Well, before, I'm violently agreeing with you. I think it's very, very hard to take DE and I to the next level, because everybody now will tell you, we've got a policy on this, we've got a policy on that, this is going on. But does it make a real discernible difference? And I think that's quite hard to decide what you're measuring or what points to real success. I'm not blowing my own trumpet here, but I was really honored when I won an Order of the British Empire for some work I did when I was at the Financial Reporting Council, the regulator of corporate governance. And some of the work we did around diversity was not difficult, but it was based on publicly, transparently putting out data on how many people, male and female, from what ethnic origin, from what social background, was entering the audit, accounting professions. And with that data, people used to say things like, well, it's shocking, isn't it, that lots of graduates go in who are female, but very rare do they make partner. Now, why is that? And everybody asked the question within a sort of huge degree of shock. But actually, the answer was the culture in a lot of the audit firms did not then work in a way that benefited family-friendly policies and so on. And I think one of the step changes is going to be, and I am seeing it happen, is that organizations who value their people show that value in very, very practical ways. Mentoring and schemes like that, I think, are starting to make a really, really big difference. And I think once you see a little bit more of that, we're at a moment in time, whereas if we continue with some of that, it will really make a difference. And then the other thing I would say, all of us as professionals need to be mindful of the sort of shadow you cast. And I've never felt more aware of that than being CEO here, because many people do still say to me, oh my gosh, it must have been a very interesting journey you took. And I think it's nice that people want to understand how you got where you are, I got where I am. Because by talking about that, by talking about some of the things that may not have gone so well, but you learn from them nonetheless, I think really helps. And I think in the past, we've had way too many senior figures who only talked about their successes. And I think talking about what you learned and the things along the way and the people who influenced you, the roles that mentors and so on can play, I think can make a massive difference. And I completely am with you on the goal, which should be far, far greater diversity. And we should think about diversity in all sorts of ways. In the UK, we're very concerned about getting people to come back into the workforce. I don't know if it's the same in the US. We're getting people who are essentially retiring far too early, and we're losing a lot of skills and experience that we could really draw on. So diversity for me now just gets broader and broader.
Yeah, I agree with all that. And it's an integral part of my responsibility and my role and yours as well. And I think this applies to all people, not even that's in the position of CEO, which is an honor and a privilege. And that title I view as something that's been bestowed upon people like you and I to give back in a better condition than it was when we first received it. It doesn't belong to us, but we should utilize it for better outcomes. And maybe the last observation on this, Tracy, is that I look at all of the tragedy that COVID visited upon us, but I think one of the things it did do, maybe one of the very few positives, I think it allowed a greater emphasis on diversity to allow the single parent, which is usually the mom, or the primary caregiver, which is usually the mom, to be able to be more engaged in the work environment without having to be present 24/7 in the office. And I think if there's a balance we have to strike, as the tendency is, let's get back to the office. Let's not be so quick to rinse out some of the opportunities that allowed somebody, again, mostly women, or even minorities that might be in your mid and back office that are living 2 or 3 zip codes away from the office. Is there a way of trying to take these gains and keep them in a sustainable way? And I know the tendency to say, hey, let's get everybody back. It sounds good, and it's how you and I grew up in this industry. But I think you have to maybe take a step back and observe the landscape a little bit.
Very wise words, Bill. And the other thing I'd say is, and again, you hope there's going to be no other big events. But, we went straight from COVID into the war in the Ukraine. This week, the Ukraine delegation is in the UK meeting ministers. I was at the stock exchange for the opening, along with the deputy PM, who's a woman, listening to some of the resilience that those people have had to show, particularly the women who, as you just articulated, have all sorts of other caring responsibilities and are dealing with the backdrop of being bombed every day. It's really humbling. And none of us know what could be next. The threats in a global context from all sorts of geopolitical forces probably never higher than in my whole lifetime. And what does that do then? What does that mean when things that we take as absolute givens can turn overnight into a completely different set of circumstances? You've also got to have agility of thinking, haven't you? And that probably stems more from diversity than anything else. So diversity as a goal is a good thing for all sorts of reasons, but particularly at a time of greater talent. Because diversity, there's a phrase, isn't there, that innovation comes mostly from a disaster, because you have to. Really serious situations require really innovative thinking. So I think that's where we might crack diversity, by just literally holding on to some of the things that have signified changes that we'd never want to now go back from. Actually working more virtually is the only positive I take out of the COVID thing. I've probably done more events with colleagues across the globe at no cost to the planet because we haven't had to fly. Travel now, you do it when you're really going to have a packed agenda and it's really going to make a difference. But in between times, you can still see people and communicate in a very, very direct way. That's massively good, isn't it?
It is. And I think something you said is a great note to end on: agility of thinking. And as we enter this period of great disruption, we've got to disrupt our thought process, because I think we've been ingrained in ways that we grew up, we learned, experiences we encountered, and they're important in terms of how it defines us, but having the agility to translate and transfer a different mindset into a very complex and changing world is going to be critical, not only for people like you and I think for our industry and the world as a whole, and we need more of that. So Tracy, with that, maybe that's a great note to end on. It's always great to talk to you. I appreciate the engagement that I see from you on social media, particularly with some of the things Kaya is doing. It means a lot to me to have the heft of your voice and support behind that. So thanks for all you do, and thank you for your partnership.
Absolutely easy to do, because it's really, I totally agree. You're really setting a lead. And I was delighted that you visited colleagues in India. That really brought a smile to my face, because that's what we need. That kind of collaboration globally is really going to make a difference. So it's been an absolute pleasure talking to you, Bill. And I will never forget that you were one of the people I met on day one in my new job here as CEO at the Chartered Institute of Securities and Investment. And that's always going to stay with me.
Well, Ed, needless to say, I brought it up at the very top, so it's stuck with me as well. So, Tracy, thanks again.
Thanks, Phil, and have a lovely weekend.
You too. Thank you for listening to Educational Alpha. I'm your host, Bill Kelly. Learn more about the Kaya Association and subscribe to the show at kaya.org. That's CAIA.org. See you next time.